Allison and friends. Sorry this is a bit late. The weekend got away from me a little bit. So today I'm going to talk about brains, specifically the difference between male and female brains. And that's heterosexual cisgender brains. When you get into homosexual individuals and transgender individuals and that, it gets much more complicated. There are significant differences between those groups that goes to prove all sorts of interesting things, but we're not going to get into that today. The first thing I need to emphasize is that this is all about averages. Not every woman and not every man is going to be like this. This is just the average of what they're all like. So the first thing I want to address is the difference between the left and the right brain. Now, a lot of people think that everything is centered in one part of the brain. But when you do a task, it just doesn't use one part of your brain and the other part just isn't doing anything. Things do get specialized. There is lateralization in the brain, and there's a focus in one part sometimes. But the other part is never just inactive. There's a difference in the specializations in male and female brains. Men's brains are more specialized, which means that a certain task is more strongly located in one part or side of the brain, as opposed to women's, where it's a more broad and less specific location. One interesting side effect of that is when an individual has a stroke, the effects are generally different in a man and a woman. It often affects just one or a certain specific number of tasks in a man, whereas a woman, it'll have a more broad effect since more activities are done in more parts of the brain. For me, one of the most interesting instances of specialization is the emotion recognition and understanding versus spatial reasoning. Now, as I'm sure you all know, men are supposed to be much better at spatial reasoning and women much better with emotions. And this does play out in the brain. Now, women's right hemisphere is specialized for emotion and computing emotion and understanding emotion, while spatial reasoning is much less specialized. For men, it's the opposite. They're much more specialized for spatial reasoning and less for emotions. There have been lots of experiments, especially for the emotions, that have stuck people in, the various brain measury things. And one of these experiments that I found pretty interesting, they put up a picture of an actor with a facial expression and asked the participant, male or female, to identify the emotion being shown. For one, I believe women were more accurate, but the more interesting part is that it took less energy for the women to do it than the men, and it was quicker. And part of that, I believe, is related to this specialization. And the question after that comes to how much of that is actually what you're born with and what your body naturally does, and how much is your culture telling you that's what you're supposed to do and giving you tasks that help you with that and encouraging you down that road so that your brain just specializes that stuff more. It looks like a lot of those specializations are natural to some extent. They've been shown to be present in infants as young as 3 months old. And this strongly suggests that it's not a cultural thing. It is a biological, developmental thing that happens naturally. The next big question is, why does this happen? What causes these different specializations? Why doesn't everyone's brain just develop the same? Current theory that I'm familiar with is that when a fetus is gestating, it gets washed in hormones. And these hormones help decide how masculine and feminine the brain will be, and that goes into how it's going to specialize. And that gets continued with the hormones created as the individual grows. And that leads us to another interesting point of the difference between femaleness and maleness. And until relatively recently, I believe, the idea was that it was one scale. You had female on one end and male on the other. But the idea now is that it's two scales. And you basically get two scores. So if you're high on femaleness and low on maleness, then you're very feminine. If it's the opposite, you're very masculine. If you're high on both, you're androgynous. If you're low on both, you're asexual, is the terms that were used when I was reading. For me, where it gets really interesting is, what can this information do for us? What do we gain from knowing what's happening in our brains? Other than just the automatic increase of awesomeness of understanding what's happening in our heads, not to mention the pretty pictures it makes. First thing that pops to mind is health. If we understand our bodies better, we can treat ourselves. And this is especially important for stroke victims or people who have been paralyzed. And then there's understanding the differences between men and women. And one of the big struggles in humans has just been those two halves understanding each other. Let me know any questions you guys have. I know this was a very brief overview. If there's a specific part of it that you'd like me to look into deeper, I'm more than willing to. This isn't my specific field of interest, but it's definitely one I hope to get into in the future. Hi, Tug. Look around. Look at me. Say hi to Leland. Yeah. Hi, Leland.